What if I told you that the woman who raised you, who made your breakfast every morning, who smiled through every hardship, carried a weight so crushing that she chose to take it to her grave rather than let you see her pain? This is the story of thousands of Japanese war brides who crossed an ocean to build new lives in America, only to discover that some wars never truly end. Hiroshima, August 1945. Haruko Nakamura was 17 years old when the world ended. She had been helping her mother Fumiko prepare breakfast when the flash came, a light so bright it seemed to tear the sky apart. In that single moment, everything she knew vanished. Her brother Takeshi had left early that morning to help clear fire breaks in the city center. He never came home. The Hiroshima that emerged from the ashes was a landscape of ghosts, where the living envied the dead, and hunger became a constant companion that gnawed at your belly and your soul. Haruko and her mother survived on scraps, on wild grass boiled into tasteless soup, on the charity of strangers who had nothing themselves. The occupation forces arrived with their trucks, their supplies, their overwhelming presence. American soldiers walked streets where Japanese families picked through rubble looking for anything salvageable, any memory of the lives they had lost. It was in this broken world that Haruko met Wesley Thornton. He was a supply clerk from Nebraska, a farm boy who had never seen devastation like this and whose eyes held a kind of horrified compassion that set him apart from the other soldiers. He started bringing food to the distribution center where Haruko volunteered, translating for elderly survivors who couldn't understand English. At first she was wary. These were the people whose planes had done this, whose bomb had killed Takeshi and tens of thousands like him. But Wesley was gentle, persistently kind in a way that slowly wore down her defenses. He learned basic Japanese phrases, mangling the pronunciation so badly that despite everything, Haruko sometimes smiled. In a world stripped of joy, those small moments felt like miracles. Her mother Fumiko was dying slowly from radiation sickness that the doctors couldn't treat and barely understood. Before she passed in the winter of 1946, she took Haruko's hand with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves and whispered that she should survive, that she should find whatever happiness this ruined world might still offer. When Wesley proposed in early 1947, Haruko said yes not just because she cared for him, but because there was nothing left for her in Japan except graves and ghosts. The War Brides Act had opened a door, and tens of thousands of Japanese women walked through it, leaving behind everything they knew for men they barely understood, and a country that wasn't sure it wanted them. Haruko became Mrs. Wesley Thornton in a simple ceremony at the occupation headquarters. There was no traditional wedding, no family present, no celebration, just paperwork, signatures, and a ticket to America. The journey across the Pacific took 2 weeks on a military transport ship, crowded with other war brides, women who spoke in hushed Japanese about their fears and hopes, about the husbands waiting on the other side, and the families they were leaving forever. Some were excited, dreaming of American prosperity they had seen in magazines. Others were terrified, clutching photographs of men they had married after knowing them for only weeks or months. Haruko stayed quiet, watching the water and wondering if she was sailing toward salvation or simply trading one kind of suffering for another. Nebraska in 1947 was nothing like Hiroshima. The flatness of the land stretched endlessly, broken only by farmhouses and grain silos that rose like lonely monuments to isolation. Wesley's family farm was outside a small town called Ashford, population 800, where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. Wesley's mother, Edith, was waiting on the porch when they arrived, her arms crossed, her face set in an expression that Haruko would come to know well over the years, polite coldness that never quite thawed into warmth. Edith shook Haruko's hand with the briefest possible contact and said welcome in a tone that meant anything but. That first dinner was excruciating. Edith served pot roast and potatoes, food that was completely foreign to Haruko, who struggled with the heavy flavors and the overwhelming portions after years of near starvation. She could feel Edith watching every awkward movement of her fork, every mistake in etiquette, cataloging each one as evidence of foreignness, of unsuitability. Wesley tried to smooth things over with forced cheerfulness that fooled no one. The town was worse. Ashford, Nebraska had sent 17 boys to fight in the Pacific, and 3 of them hadn't come home. Their names were on a memorial plaque outside the courthouse, and their mothers shopped at the same grocery store where Haruko bought vegetables. their eyes following her with barely concealed hostility. She was the enemy living among them, the Japanese woman who had somehow seduced one of their boys. Mrs. Gladys Pritchard, who lived 3 houses down, made a point of turning away whenever Haruko tried to greet her. At church, families shifted in their pews to avoid sitting near the Thorntons, as if Haruko carried some contagion that might spread through proximity. The minister was polite but distant, his sermons about forgiveness and Christian charity apparently not extending to Japanese war brides. Haruko learned to keep her head down, to speak as little as possible, to make herself small and unobtrusive in the hope that invisibility might be safer than presence. The language barrier made everything harder. Wesley had promised to help her learn English, but he was busy with farm work from dawn to dusk, and Edith certainly wasn't going to teach her. Haruko struggled with a second-hand English textbook, trying to decode the strange sounds and even stranger grammar. Simple tasks became ordeals. Shopping meant pointing at items and hoping the store clerk understood, enduring their impatient sighs and occasional mockery of her accent. Using the telephone was nearly impossible. She once tried to call a doctor when Wesley was sick with flu, but the receptionist couldn't understand her and hung up in frustration. Haruko sat by the phone afterward, shaking with humiliation and helplessness, feeling the weight of her foreignness like a physical thing pressing down on her chest. She wrote letters to Michiko Fujiwara, another war bride she had met on the ship who had settled in California, and Michiko's responses were the only thing that made her feel less alone. But even those stopped after a year when Michiko's husband got transferred overseas, and they lost touch. Wesley tried in his limited way to be supportive. He defended her once when his uncle made a crude joke about Japanese women at a family gathering, which resulted in a shouting match and a rift that took years to heal. But he also asked her not to speak Japanese in public, not to cook Japanese food when his mother visited, not to do anything that might draw more attention or cause more problems. He was caught between 2 worlds, and increasingly, Haruko realized that when forced to choose, he would always choose the easier path, the one that didn't require him to fight his entire community. She couldn't entirely blame him. He was a simple man who wanted a quiet life, and she had brought complexity and conflict into his world. But that understanding didn't make the loneliness any less crushing. She was profoundly alone in a way that went beyond physical isolation, alone in a crowd, alone in her marriage, alone with memories and trauma that she couldn't share because no one wanted to hear them. Their first child, Lorraine, was born in 1949. Haruko had hoped that motherhood might soften Edith, might give them common ground, but if anything, it made things worse. Edith had opinions about everything: how to hold the baby, how to feed her, how to dress her, and all of those opinions implicitly criticized Haruko's Japanese way of doing things. When Haruko tried to carry Lorraine on her back in the traditional Japanese style, Edith was horrified, insisting it was dangerous and backward. When she sang Japanese lullabies, Edith asked pointedly if she wouldn't prefer to sing American songs so the child could understand. The message was clear. Lorraine was to be raised American, with no trace of her mother's heritage to mark her as different or foreign. Haruko complied, not because she agreed, but because she had learned that resistance only brought more pain. She sang Brahms' lullaby instead of the songs Fumiko had sung to her. She made pot roast and meatloaf instead of the Japanese dishes she craved. She erased herself bit by bit, trying to become the kind of mother and wife that Ashford, Nebraska might accept. But acceptance never came. Lorraine started school in 1954, and Haruko discovered that her daughter would inherit her foreignness, whether she wanted to or not. The other children called Lorraine names, Slant Eye and Jap, even though Lorraine looked more like Wesley than Haruko. Teachers were sympathetic but unhelpful, suggesting that Lorraine would need to develop a thick skin. Haruko attended a parent-teacher conference once and felt the stares of other mothers, heard their whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. One woman, emboldened by others, asked her directly how she could live with herself, marrying an American after what her people had done at Pearl Harbor. Haruko had no answer that would satisfy them. What could she say? That she had lost as much as they had, that Takeshi had died just as surely as their sons, that suffering wasn't a competition, and grief didn't recognize national boundaries? She said nothing, just endured the hostility and went home to cry in private where Lorraine wouldn't see. She never told Lorraine about Hiroshima, never described the flash, the heat, the screams, the bodies charred beyond recognition. The weeks of searching for Takeshi among the dead and dying. Never explained how her mother had wasted away. Her hair falling out in clumps, blood seeping from her gums. Her body betraying her cell by cell. Never shared the nightmares that still woke her in the middle of the night, gasping and disoriented. Reaching for people who had been dead for years. Wesley knew some of it, but even he didn't know the full extent, and Haruko preferred it that way. What good would it do to burden him with horrors he couldn't change or understand? What purpose would it serve to traumatize Lorraine with stories of suffering that would only make her different, only mark her more clearly as the daughter of the enemy? Haruko convinced herself that silence was protection, that by carrying the weight alone she was shielding her children from pain. It never occurred to her that silence had its own cost, that the distance it created might be worse than the truth. A second child came in 1952, a son they named Robert. Edith was delighted to have a grandson, and her attention shifted largely to him, which was almost a relief. Haruko threw herself into motherhood with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if by being the perfect mother she could somehow compensate for being the wrong kind of wife, the wrong kind of neighbor, the wrong kind of woman for Ashford, Nebraska. She kept an immaculate house, cooked elaborate meals, volunteered at the school despite the cold reception, attended every church service even though she felt like a perpetual outsider. She smiled when people were rude, stayed quiet when they were cruel, and swallowed her anger and hurt until it became a hard knot in her chest that never quite dissolved. The 1950s rolled on, prosperity and optimism for everyone except those who didn't quite fit the American ideal. Haruko watched other families through windows, saw their easy laughter and casual affection, and wondered what it felt like to belong so completely that you never questioned your place in the world. Mrs. Gladys Pritchard remained a constant source of small cruelties. She complained about the Thorntons to anyone who would listen, spreading rumors that Haruko was teaching her children Japanese in secret, that she kept a Buddhist shrine in the house, that she was somehow contaminating the neighborhood with her presence. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than the comfort of prejudice. Other neighbors were more subtle but no less exclusionary. Birthday party invitations for Lorraine and Robert were rare. Playdates never happened. The Thornton children were tolerated at school but never quite included, always on the periphery of social circles that closed ranks against them. Haruko saw her children's hurt and loneliness, and felt responsible, felt that her very existence was the source of their suffering. She considered leaving, taking the children and disappearing to a city where they might be anonymous, but she had no money of her own, no skills that would earn her a living, and nowhere to go. She was trapped by circumstances and by her own choices, and all she could do was endure. Wesley grew more distant as the years passed. He wasn't cruel, never raised his hand or his voice, but he retreated into work and silence, coming home exhausted and uncommunicative, eating dinner without conversation, falling asleep in front of the television. Haruko wondered sometimes if he regretted marrying her. If given the chance to do it over, he would have left Hiroshima alone and found a nice Nebraska girl who would have made his life easier. She never asked because she was afraid of the answer. Their marriage became a functional arrangement. Two people sharing a house and children but little else. Polite strangers who had once believed they might build something more. Intimacy faded, replaced by routine and resignation. Haruko stopped expecting understanding or support and learned to find strength in herself, in the quiet determination that had carried her through Hiroshima and would carry her through this slower, subtler kind of devastation. The children grew, and Haruko watched them become American in ways she never could. Lorraine was bright and determined, pushing back against the prejudice she faced with a fierceness that both worried and impressed Haruko. Robert was quieter, more like Wesley, content to blend in and avoid conflict. They spoke English without an accent, ate hamburgers and hot dogs without hesitation, pledged allegiance to the flag every morning at school. They were American, and Haruko was glad for them even as it created distance between them. They couldn't understand her, not really, couldn't grasp the weight of history and loss she carried, and she didn't want them to. She wanted them to be free of it, to have the uncomplicated lives she had never had. So she kept her silence, kept her past locked away, and became more shadow than person in her own home, present but not fully there, always holding something back. In 1963, Edith Thornton died of a heart attack. Haruko felt nothing at the funeral except a vague relief that she would no longer have to endure her mother-in-law's cold disapproval. She felt guilty about that relief, as if it proved she was the heartless person Edith had always believed her to be. Wesley grieved quietly, and Haruko comforted him as best she could, but there was a wall between them that neither knew how to breach. After Edith's death, Haruko found letters in the attic, correspondence between Edith and her sister in Iowa, full of complaints about the Japanese woman who had ruined Wesley's life, who was raising half-breed children, who would never be truly American. Reading those letters, Haruko felt the accumulated weight of years of silent endurance pressing down on her. She burned the letters in the fireplace and never mentioned them to anyone. The 1960s brought change to America, civil rights movements, and social upheaval, but Ashford remained largely unchanged, a pocket of conservative values and old prejudices. Lorraine went to college in 1967, escaping to Lincoln and a larger world where being half Japanese was less of a defining characteristic. She came home less and less, and Haruko didn't blame her. Robert followed in 1970, studying agriculture to eventually take over the farm. The house felt emptier with the children gone, the silence between Haruko and Wesley more pronounced. They were in their 40s, no longer young, their lives half over, and Haruko looked back and wondered what it had all been for. She had survived Hiroshima only to spend decades dying slowly in Nebraska, erasing herself, swallowing her pain, becoming invisible. Was survival worth it if you had to give up everything that made you yourself? She started having health problems in the 1970s. Nothing specific, just a general decline that doctors couldn't quite diagnose. Fatigue, weight loss, persistent pain that moved around her body. Wesley took her to specialists in Omaha who ran tests and found nothing conclusive. Haruko suspected it was radiation sickness, delayed effects from Hiroshima finally catching up with her, but she didn't tell the doctors about that. What would be the point? There was no treatment, no cure, and bringing it up would only invite questions she didn't want to answer. She accepted the decline as she had accepted everything else with quiet resignation. She was 50 years old and felt ancient, worn down by years of carrying weight no one else could see. Lorraine married in 1972, a nice young man from Lincoln who treated her well. They had children, Haruko's grandchildren, who called her grandma, and had no idea she was Japanese except in the most abstract sense. Haruko held her granddaughter for the first time and felt a complicated mixture of joy and sorrow. This child would never know what Haruko had survived, would never understand the price paid for her comfortable American life. That was good. That was what Haruko had wanted, but it also meant that Takeshi and Fumiko and all the others who had died in Hiroshima would be forgotten, would fade into history as if they had never existed. Haruko was the only one who remembered them, and when she died, they would die again, finally and completely. Wesley passed away in 1981 from a stroke, sudden and unexpected. He was 60 years old. Haruko found him in the barn already gone and called the ambulance even though she knew it was too late. She mourned him, genuinely, despite everything. He had tried in his limited way to be a good husband, and if he had failed to truly see her or understand her, that was perhaps too much to expect from a Nebraska farm boy who had never left the country, except to occupy a defeated enemy. The funeral was well attended. Wesley had been liked in the community in a way Haruko never was. People offered condolences that felt perfunctory, their discomfort with her still evident after more than 30 years. Mrs. Gladys Pritchard, ancient and bitter, told Haruko at the reception that at least Wesley was at peace now, the implication being that marriage to Haruko had been a burden he was finally released from. Haruko smiled politely and said nothing, as she had said nothing for decades. She lived alone after that, staying on the farm even though Lorraine and Robert urged her to move to an apartment in town. She was 62 years old and felt like she was finally, for the first time since leaving Japan, able to breathe. No one to perform for, no one to hide from, no one whose life she might complicate with her existence. She kept to herself, tended a small garden where she finally, after all these years, grew Japanese vegetables that she had craved for decades, cooked the food she remembered from childhood. It was a small rebellion, decades too late, but it felt like reclaiming some tiny piece of herself that she had abandoned. She started writing not for publication but for herself, trying to record what had happened in Hiroshima, what she had lost, what she had survived. The words came slowly, painfully in Japanese that felt rusty after years of disuse. She filled notebooks with memories, trying to preserve something of Takeshi and Fumiko, trying to make sense of a life that had been shaped by forces beyond her control. The diagnosis came in 1985, cancer, aggressive and already advanced. The doctors said it might be related to radiation exposure, asked when she had been exposed, and Haruko finally, after 40 years, told them about Hiroshima. They were surprised, hadn't known, and she realized that even her medical records had erased this fundamental fact of her existence. The treatment options were limited, and Haruko declined most of them. She was 67 years old and tired, so profoundly tired, and the idea of fighting to extend a life that had been more endurance than joy held little appeal. Lorraine was devastated, wanted her to try everything, couldn't understand her mother's calm acceptance. How could Lorraine understand? She had never known what Haruko had survived, what she had carried, how exhausting it had been to wake up every day and continue pretending that everything was fine. In her final months, Haruko thought about telling Lorraine and Robert everything, about breaking the silence she had maintained for so long. But what would it accomplish except to burden them with guilt and grief? They had their own lives, their own families, and they didn't need to know how much their mother had suffered to give them those comfortable American existences. The silence had become so habitual that breaking it felt impossible, like trying to speak a language she had forgotten. She burned most of the notebooks she had written, keeping only one that she hid in the back of a closet, unsure what she wanted done with it. It was a coward's compromise, not quite revealing the truth but not quite destroying it either, leaving the decision to chance or fate. Haruko Nakamura Thornton died in February 1986, in a hospital in Omaha, with Lorraine and Robert at her bedside. Her last words were in Japanese, something neither of them understood, a final retreat into the self she had hidden for so long. They buried her next to Wesley in the Ashford Cemetery, under a headstone that gave her American name and American dates, with no mention of Hiroshima or Japan, or anything that had made her who she was. The funeral was small, a handful of people who had known Wesley rather than Haruko, who remained a mystery even in death. Lorraine and Robert went through her things, found the notebook in Japanese that neither could read, and put it aside to deal with later. Life moved on, as it always does, and Haruko faded into memory, the quiet Japanese woman who had married Wesley Thornton, and lived a quiet life, and died quietly, leaving no particular mark on the world. It wasn't until the 1990s that Lorraine began to understand. She was in her 40s, her own children grown, when she started researching Japanese war brides for a community college class she was taking. She read academic papers about the War Brides Act, about the tens of thousands of Japanese women who had immigrated to America in the late 1940s and early 1950s, about the discrimination and isolation they had faced. She read oral histories of war brides who described experiences that sounded hauntingly familiar, the hostile communities, the language barriers, the profound loneliness, the decision to remain silent to protect their children. She read about Hiroshima, really read about it for the first time, about the scale of the devastation and the long-term effects of radiation, and suddenly her mother's mysterious health problems and early death made terrible sense. She found the notebook, finally had it translated, and read her mother's words for the first time, the descriptions of Takeshi's death, of watching Fumiko waste away, of the hunger and fear and desperation of post-war Japan, the accounts of arriving in Nebraska and facing prejudice that was less violent, but no less damaging than the bomb had been, the loneliness, the constant performance of being acceptable, the slow erasure of self, her mother's voice, finally heard, decades too late. Lorraine wept reading it, understanding for the first time the weight her mother had carried alone, the sacrifice she had made to give her children normal American lives. She felt grief and guilt in equal measure, grief for what her mother had endured, guilt that she had never asked, never pushed past the silence, never tried to truly know the woman who had raised her. She tried to talk to Robert about it, but he was less interested, preferred to remember their mother as she had appeared rather than as she had been. Maybe that was easier. Maybe Haruko had been right to keep her silence, to spare them this knowledge. But Lorraine couldn't let it go. She started interviewing other children of war brides, found dozens of people with similar stories, mothers who had suffered in silence, who had died without their children really knowing them. She contributed to oral history projects, trying to ensure that these women's experiences weren't lost to history, that someone remembered and bore witness to their quiet courage and their terrible loneliness. It became a kind of mission, a way to honor her mother and all the other Harukos who had crossed an ocean and found that some distances could never be bridged. In 2005, Lorraine returned to Ashford for the first time in years. The town had shrunk, many businesses closed, the population aging and declining. Mrs. Gladys Pritchard had died years ago. The grocery store where her mother had faced silent hostility was now a dollar store. The church they had attended was struggling to keep its doors open. The memorial plaque with the names of boys who died in the Pacific was weathered and hard to read. Ashford was dying, and Lorraine felt no nostalgia for it, only anger at what it had done to her mother, how it had treated a survivor of unimaginable horror as an enemy to be shunned. She visited her parents' graves, stood looking at the headstone that told so little of the truth, and wished she could go back and tell her younger self to ask questions, to push past her mother's silence, to insist on knowing her as a person rather than just as mom. But time only moves in one direction, and the dead don't answer questions. All Lorraine could do was remember and tell her mother's story to anyone who would listen, and hope that somewhere, somehow, Haruko knew that she had finally been seen, finally been understood, finally been recognized for the extraordinary strength it had taken to survive not just Hiroshima, but the decades that followed. The war brides had crossed an ocean thinking they were escaping devastation, not realizing they were sailing toward a different kind of battle, one fought in silence and solitude, one that left no visible scars, but wounded just as deeply. Thousands of women like Haruko had lived and died in America, their stories untold, their suffering unacknowledged, their sacrifices taken for granted by children who never knew what their mothers had endured to give them better lives. This is why her children never knew how much their Japanese war bride mothers suffered in silence during the 1940s and beyond, because Haruko chose silence, chose to carry the weight alone, chose to protect them from knowledge that she believed would only hurt them. Whether that choice was right or wrong, wise or tragic, is impossible to say. What is certain is that silence has a cost, that invisibility is its own kind of death, and that the most profound acts of love sometimes go unrecognized until it's far too late to say thank you, or I'm sorry, or I see you, I finally see you. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel. Give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. These stories matter, and remembering them honors the strength of those who suffered in silence.